It's Doug Lynner, and I'm here with Willard van de Bogart, and we're sitting in my living room, and we've been visiting here for the last couple of days. Willard's from Bangkok, Thailand, but he's been here in San Francisco for a little bit for a visit, so we're lucky to have him here visiting. And we've been talking a lot about music, of course. That's what we do. Mm-hmm. We talk about music, and sometimes we play even. Yep. You know. And but we've been talking a lot about our own musics and where we're going and what we're thinking and doing. And so we thought we'd turn on the camera and talk a little bit on camera about it. So Willard, you're a man with a mission, right? Your music has a really strong, focused mission, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, but in a general sense, you are very concerned about communication, and you're very concerned about how we as people are influenced by sound, how we influence sound, how we're made of sound, how we manifest it. Right. Explain.
Those are all the issues that we have been talking about. The mission, I think, is how sound influences the direction of how we think as human beings. And I think we have a lot of sound today that is maybe not as more conducive to entertainment and pleasure. And I have maybe put an overlay of some philosophy behind it, you might say, or a way of thinking, how we're integrated into the universe as sonic beings. I have characterized it to be a sonic being, and I think out of that I have a sense that the sounds that, at least from an electronic musician's point of view, and since it's a new kind of sound, and maybe you can do it. I mean, there's been a lot of composers like Host with the Planets, and other famous classical musicians have made sounds that pay homage to the universe, the stars. I find myself in the world of the early 21st century, where there's a lot of ecological concerns and a lot of problems, and a lot of people are trying to find solutions to our dilemma. And everyone asks, what can I do? What can I do? And I ask myself what I can do. And my tool is the electronic synthesizer. So I've asked myself many times, well, is there any way electronic music could be conducive to helping the planet and that type of thing? So that's where the mission originated from. And so that's kind of like an answer there. And I know you've been very involved in just recently coming back from Sweden and making sounds for Will Jackson, who passed away, and as sort of a homage to him, and do constant concerts with sound. And I know the two of us have been batting it back and forth about what are you thinking about when you're on the stage thinking, do you think about anything? And you say to me, no, I'm not thinking about anything. So I think I could throw the question back to you. Do you have a mission? Do you think you're on a mission to make sounds, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I think, I suppose in a way I'm on a mission. I mean, I guess you got to be to do it for your whole life, there's got to be something propelling it. I think that the difference in how I could explain my mission in reference to what you were just speaking of is that my mission is more sound oriented. It's more freedom of sound. The slug line that I've used for many years, and I use with my record label, is sound for sound's sake. And I kind of mean, there's a lot of meanings to that, but part of it is that sound exists with its own personality and life. And this is an area where we're like, we come like this on, of sound having life.
Right.
But, I have this kind of overriding view that that I'm observing this life and not so much trying to be the controller of that life. So that's that element of sound for sound's sake. Now, part of where it goes into sound for not for sound's sake is like, with generic music, and I don't mean boring music, I mean music in genres. Like, blues sounds a certain way, and you play an instrument to do that, and it sounds just that way, and immediately it's identified in that way.
Okay.
It's my hope that that sounds I make are far less generic, and they're far less supportive of a musical point of view, and far more freeing of the sounds to exist in their own life on their own terms.
I gotcha. Well, sound for sound's sake, we talked about that, and the independence of sound to make a sound, and non-generic, as you're saying, and have it exist and pay homage to the sound, and not be the controller of the sound. Now, I'll throw it back on myself. Sound for sound's sake. My impression of that, my feelings about that I've come into the realization that sound has its own kind of life on its own. That comes close to what I think you're saying, sound for sound's sake. And then you asked me, I think before, well, are you controlling the sound, or are you the master of the sound, or are you letting the sound be for sound's sake? Well, the filtering, the realization of the sound in the first place, I think, for me, had come about, well, from a protein synthesizer that Marcus Buehler had invented at MIT. And it was for the first time that proteins, you could hear proteins. And the protein has a significant signature. And I came to the realization that for the first time I'm hearing a part of me that I can't hear, and realize that not only do I make sound, but now I can hear myself. And that taught me at that point that sound has, with our intuitive nature and our ability to sort of like understand how we're going about to make a sound, that it was more than me just making the sound, that I was actually creating a sound that was also inside of me. It sort of welled up inside of me.
Well, and it seems like, if I understand you, that you're saying too, when you say that, with the protein synthesizer, that you're hearing yourself.
Right.
You're saying literally that you're hearing your biome through the expression of these proteins. Is that?
Well, that's correct, but they are mixed with all the other, the 30 years or so of having an electronic synthesizer in front of me.
Right, it's through the Willard filter, ultimately.
That was, well,
right.
The Willard filter.
No, I mean, you're using this to as part of your creation of sound. You're using other instruments as well, and you're...
but all of a sudden, the protein synthesizer came in, and all of a sudden it was like I did have my own filter for my machines, but all of a sudden I realized that there was an ongoing sound that was always going to be there. And so I just recorded a piece called Undercurrents. So the undercurrent is this underlying sound that you can't hear, that's a part of you, and all of a sudden I have this realization that I'm a part of a larger sound. And then I became very philosophical about it, and realized that I may in fact be the ultimate synthesizer. I am a synthesizer. You call yourself the synthesizer man, right. But essentially that's what we are.
Yeah.
I think synthesized beings that choose to make these sounds. And you have many kinds of colors of definitions. And maybe you could talk about that. How would you define your own sounds? Is it possible?
Well, yeah, I guess it is in some ways. I mean, there's. I like to work with basic building blocks, and so my sounds are immediate, and I don't do too much enhancement of them. Reverb, usually never echo, almost never, not for most of my pieces, or delay. So I like to kind of leave things bare, and in fact, one thing I like to do in my music is even when I have a complex thing going on, I like to sometimes whittle it down so that people can hear the bones of the piece. Sometimes those bones might be the triggers that are causing all of the activity to happen. For instance, that was a way that I did it recently in the Swedish performance, where several times, I had all these big things going on, and then I just reduced it so that you could hear the triggers that were causing them to happen. So exposing the bones. I also like to expose kind of the compositional intent bones of pieces as I perform them too. And for instance, typically speaking, I if I'm doing a tonally oriented piece, I'll have a very fast sequence of of notes going on, fast, like maybe as fast as 440 hertz, right? Really fast. And so typically in the piece you'll never hear that. You'll hear things that I extract from it. But every once in a while, I'll let it come through in a corner or something, because again, I like to expose the bones of the pieces.
But you do. I think another question for you is that you play maybe 40 minutes. I generally, my time frame for any performance is anywhere between 30, 40 minutes, in between maybe 26 minutes, or as a run, or so to speak. And I do practice a run. I mean, I do give myself an imposed time frame. As I'm going to run my sounds for 30 minutes. Now, so the question is for you, when you run your sounds for X amount of time, do you predetermine how much time you're going to run? And if you don't, and you just run it and quit, what's your rationale for the continuation of your sound over a length of time? And then after that, I'll give you my interpretation of why I do a run for a length of time. So when you sit in front of the synthesizer, and you've already explained the things that you do, bringing the sounds down, using notes and these types of things, clearly understood. But what I'm trying to find out with you is, as you run the time and the sounds are being made, what goes on in your mind, I suppose? Or do you have a pre-thought out reason why you're, I'm going to make this, you could, like, for instance, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to make the first part kind of like an overture and make it more melodic, but the second part I'm going to add some really bass notes and undercurrent notes. Then I'm going to end with some, lighter sounds. What type of organizational ideas do you have when you sit down and start to play?
Well, let me divide it into two first and get rid of one part and not talk about it, because it doesn't really fit. And that is, sometimes I do pure improvisation with other people, and in those cases, obviously, it's just what happens at the moment. And in some cases, I've not met the people before sitting down to play with them. Right. So let's leave that part off the table, because it doesn't really fit in the conversation. When I'm doing a piece of mine and playing, typically in a solo context, it's totally worked out in advance. I start with a blank palette of an instrument, and I start with an idea and a compositional intention. And everything I do from that moment is to realize that intention. And the intention can be compositional intentions can be expressed in any number of ways. It could be like, as you explained, that at some point I want to bring in a bass note, and later I want to have high end, blah, blah, blah. That's one way that you could express a compositional intention. Another compositional intention could be that maybe you're trying to, get a response, like when you did, Chaco Canyon, and you're trying to see if you can engage, right? That could be another compositional intention. So I start with a clear compositional intention. Then I decide what I need technologically to support that intention, and I build an instrument. In the case of the Eurorack stuff, I build an instrument with a specific complex of modules for that purpose. And I go into a performance knowing what I'm going to do at what time. I go in having a fixed time. I know how long I'm going to play when I go and get up on stage, I put my phone over here and I turn a clock on. And this is my reference for my performance.
Okay.
The reason why I put the clock on is not so much to figure out when I'm over, but to keep track of the proportions of what I intend to do in my performance.
Yeah.
And because it's easy to get lost in the moment and do something faster than than you're feeling like it happened, or the opposite. So I do keep that as a reference, because while I'm playing, I'm not in the room so much. I'm partially there, but I'm partially, elsewhere, kind of reacting in the moment musical sense. But I still have an eye on my structure. I still have an eye on where I am in that structure. Right. And of course, I have the instruments laid out in order to realize it. So that's kind of where I come from.
It sounds very similar to my own approach.
Yeah.
I think what I don't hear, and as you know, I think you came up with a good description for me as a think-assist. rather than a synthesis player, you're a think-assist player. I found that very interesting. So I have what we would call a cosmological bass, an undercurrent cosmological bass, as a thinking being, and I think there's been a crossover, intentional crossover, for being this thinking being about a cosmology and where we are in time and space with the instrument. So the instrument sort of becomes a vehicle to support the cosmological viewpoint. But I think the interesting thing about that is when I'm actually sitting down and playing, I'm not so sure the cosmological viewpoint comes into play, because I have time notation, which I don't look at. So I pretty much fluidly allow myself to just engage with the synthesizer. And I guess hope might be it. I don't know if it's possible to actually make a sound that is cosmologically oriented. But nonetheless, everything I believe about making sound hinges on that aspect. So I think the intentional drive that I have when I make the sound is that it's going to open up the listener's mind to travel with their thoughts, because there's no reference to a melody or anything like that. So I'm kind of the opinion that it might give the opportunity to explore their own way of thinking rather than thinking about the music. So then it goes into a sort of a thought. I'm even interested in the way the other person is going to think when they hear the music.
Well, that's something a composer should think about. Even if it's just to decide they don't care, they should think about that for sure at some point along in their development, right?
There's been a lot of conversation, though. I read, some Italian composers, how the electronic music actually affects the listener. What is the listener, and what can the composer make a difference with what they're doing in terms of what they think they would like to have the audience think about. Okay, so is there a strong relationship to what the composer is thinking and what the audience is thinking? What do you think about that?
Well, I talk with students of mine about this very thing, and because I think that it's important to deal with how you're going to relate to an audience. Again, it's the answer to how you're going to relate to the audience is not nearly as important as asking the question and giving it some thought, in my view. But I think that when you're dealing with an audience, you're dealing with a fairly predictable circumstance. Now, of course, if you're famous, it could be different than if you're not. But let's just say the average person playing electronic music going into the Luggage Gallery, for instance, here in San Francisco, a wonderful series. There's going to be, because of various people coming, some of them are friends of another act and everything. Let's say that you got, just for ease of numbers, you got 10 people in the audience. one or two of them are going to like really get where you're going to come from, and they're going to really be right on it, and maybe sometimes to the point that it's even going to like re-inspire you that there's this feedback. And of course there's going to be 2 or 3 people who just think that what's going on here in front of them is the least understandable thing on the planet that they've ever encountered, and I don't care if it's you or me or whomever's doing it. And then in between there, those 5 people that are left are gold. Yeah. This is where the ability to develop a common aesthetic exists. Right. Now, what do you do to develop that aesthetic? Do you play to them? Do you play things they want to hear, like in a pop context? I don't think so. I don't think that's what you should do at all. I think you should play the music that you've got there, that you've come there to play, that is your intention. And that you should engage. You shouldn't be offended by the people who don't get it and don't care. Right. You should be encouraged by the people who do. And you should create a conversation with the rest of them and to help them. They're there to develop their aesthetic, and you can be part of that.
So this feedback is a feedback issue. You do feedback in your own music, and
yeah, that's one of the things I really enjoy doing these days.
Well, I'm interested in the feedback from the audience. I remember way back in 1971, I played in Washington D.C. For the Committee for the Future with Barbara Marx Hubbard. And I brought all my equipment there, and it was the first time I'd really gone out into the public with the electronic music in '71. And people would, at that time, many years ago, they would come up to the console and they would actually touch the equipment to find out if it was real. Huh. They couldn't believe. There was a disbelief.
Right, there was a disconnect.
It didn't even exist. They just didn't. They couldn't believe it. It was a fantasy made real that they wanted to find out if it was real, and they had no comprehension of how to deal with it. Okay, so let's come up 40, 50 years. Now we are into the future from 1971, which is a long time, I guess. And now the feedback from the audience comes, wow, it just made me feel good, or wow, I met my grandmother when she was alive, or wow, I've been so sick but I feel healthy. So I've been constantly getting feedback from people that it makes them feel good. Now, of course, if I got a feedback, oh wow, I had this great idea, this music made me think like I've never thought before, I would like that feedback a lot. So feedback, I think, is a positive thing. It endorses certain kinds of. I've had bottles thrown at me on the stage as well.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is that, as a composer and a performer, if your whole validation system is based on what the audience says to you, you're in for a rough ride.
Oh gosh.
That's just not how to do this. Right. If that's your motivation, you really ought to be doing something else, because first of all, playing electronic music doesn't get huge amounts of adoration, and doesn't always get even pleasant responses. Fortunately, I don't get too much horrible stuff, but the reason for that is because people who like what I do come to see me play, and it's
well, you have a reputation, and you seem to be fortifying that reputation. People want you to come back, and you've obviously gotten positive feedback.
Yeah,
but I hear what you're saying.
I'd like to know about the feedback from your point of view. Like, one of the things that I see affecting young performers is if somebody says something bad, it can really put them into a tailspin, and if there's a bad reaction in an audience, it can really affect them in a big way. And I can appreciate that. You're exposing your soul out there, and it's pretty hard to, accept response that you weren't hoping for, and that might be rude. Some people aren't nice about this stuff. But how does it affect you? Are you overly do you have a mechanism that shields you from the extremes so that you can kind of just stay on your path? How do you deal with any kind of whether it's really positive or negative, whatever it might be? What do you do to remain yourself in the midst of that interaction?
Well, I throw we all have to throw ourselves out into once you're in front of the people, I mean, when you sit down, you turn the on button on, and we talked about this, and so there is an engagement, and I would never, turn that button on or be on a stage unless I thought I was going to do something. I mean,
Right.
that's the only reason I'm there, is to do something. And the doing of the something is the challenge. Is it going to represent...
And the power. Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, it is an improvisation, I think, but it's also the sound has to come to life before I actually play. I create the bass foundation first, I think, and I have to find the sound, and that's been a new progressive idea that it's come to me, and that is very closely related to sound having a life form. When you water a plant or a seedling, it slowly comes up. It doesn't come up all at once, but it does, and it flowers. And I think it's the same playing the electronic music. You know that you've got an entity within all this equipment that makes a sound, and you're pushing and turning and pushing buttons. You hear the sound. You have an audience. You can't do it forever. You can't play forever. I mean, like that. I mean, you could, but I don't want to. I'm trying to get to my intentional point. Where there's life, and I'll accept the dandelion, I'll accept the daffodil, whatever it wants to be, I'll give it its life form.
Right.
Once that's achieved, then I play on top of it. And, the feedback that I've got there hasn't been any negative feedback. I mean, early on, yes, and I was ignorant and naive early on.
Mm-hmm.
I had I don't think I had a contiguous kind of philosophical approach to electronic music, other than I'm going out into space and meeting aliens or something wild and crazy. But now it's xenolinguistics. Now it's the language of the universe. Now it's how sound creates life. Now it's vibratory physics. Now it's quantum mechanics. Now it's a whole host of other things that are combined to make a being that's full of sound.
Yeah.
So I think for the most part the feedback has been positive. It's been constructive, and people basically at the luggage store that you mentioned, and also over at Shapeshifters, especially Denmark, I mean, that was a huge acceptance.
Yeah.
So far so good, I'd say, but the onus isn't, I'm not going to use that to sit back and say, oh, I make beautiful music, so I don't have to worry. I'm going to go out there and make beautiful music.
Right.
I'm not that way.
Right, exactly. So, and that's how I feel too, is that while I appreciate excellent response and dialogue with an audience, I'm not there pandering for it, and it's not the point of it. I've said oftentimes that if I didn't have an audience, and I didn't have a synthesizer, and I didn't have electricity, well, I would be alone banging some rocks together singing.
I was trying to say that, right?
And so the real imperative is music making, and all of the other things are kind of parts of life that become entwined with it because you decide to do it in public for other people, blah blah blah.
Right.
But for me, it's a fundamental imperative is to make music and sound, and all the rest of this is just kind of how it happened.
Yeah, the bull roar. You've heard me play the bull roar, where you swing this stick and it makes this hum. And these are played all over the earth. Every indigenous culture has a bull roar, and they all have a different frequency. And those frequencies, it's 20,000 years old. I mean, they've even found one in one of the tombs of Egypt, with a little hole and a stick. So how is it that happen? I know Morley, I think Morley is his last name. He did an anthropological study on the history of sound. So here we are in the 21st century, and look what we have. I mean, so the developers are very important to me. I don't want to make it just our sounds. I think for me it's the developers.
You're speaking of iOS app developers for music.
Yeah, I'm an iOS musician. Yeah. I belong to the iOS iPad musician group, and I follow the 5 or 6 developers very closely, and talk to them, and they talk back, and they say they're building a new oscillator that'll do this, or a new bank of making your own designs. And I ask myself, well, why is it that the developers of the equipment most of them aren't musicians, they're developers. They develop an instrument that you can make sound. So then there's the user. So anybody can go buy an iPad and buy the app for $20. Then what? Okay, so then what? So this interaction between developer and user, audience, intention, this is a kind of a complex social phenomenon. Not anyone can go do it, anyone. But to do it, to be intentionally to do it, to put yourself with the little instrument on the stage and all of a sudden turn the button, and it makes sounds independent of you doing anything. But if you do something with it, what do you do? And then you ask the question, why did the developer give me the opportunity to make this sound, or any sound? So I find it quite fascinating that we as a culture are evolving with our instruments, if we so choose. And I think the electronic synthesizer is a perfect example of technological adaptation, as I'm calling my new paper, and to the sound. It's almost given us the opportunity to relate to sound in a different way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've talked a few times at presentations about a thought I've had, and that is that in so many ways that we're related as artists in electronic music, we're related to the space race. I feel that way very much myself. The space race, as defined by the launching of Sputnik, happened on my 5th birthday. And so I find that most of my life has been in parallel with this point in history, the space race and beyond now. And of course the technology that we utilize in synthesizers and in computers and so forth many times had their impetus and creation in aerospace and the space race and all that, because that's where new technologies were being developed. And but there was another component beyond the technology and the time frame, and that was that we found ourselves at a time in our history where we wanted to hear things that it wasn't possible to hear, because these rockets and our imaginations were going off into space where there were many things to experience, and yet we had no way to directly experience them. So I think that we found ourselves in a time when people wanted to understand what sounds might exist in areas that they couldn't possibly hear them. And the synthesizer just happened to be there as a product of that whole mesh of things, and began in that way. And I think well, I know that as an element of my own life in synthesis and music is that to this day I am constantly endeavoring to hear the sound that I haven't heard yet and that I can't hear. And so I find this interesting thing about the space race and all of that, and curiously enough, or not surprisingly, and specifically in your case, space music was a place where many people began with synthesizers, and you did. But of course, your backstory, so to speak, your philosophy, your thinking went from like a broad interest in space to a very specific, actual, constructive effort in that like really broad general arena of space. So it's no longer space music, it's communication, it's language, it's xenolinguistics.
It's xenolinguistics, right. I mean, my own childhood hearing sounds or voices in my head or something like that left a big impression. And I've had interviews with me where how science fiction has become a platform for electronic music. So there's a coloration, that everyone would think that it's science fiction. It already has a space orientation to it.
It's easy for people to understand it in that way.
But when you put xenolinguistics into it, as you're saying, then you get into the language, xeno being, foreign, out of this world.
Yeah.
Insects, of course, you try to communicate. I've done a lot of insects recordings and stuff. You try to communicate with animals. So we do insert the sound of different living beings. But what about a living being that's made out of magnetic fields? What if there was what about if there was an entity that could exchange information through magnetics?
Right, or through heat levels, or
all those things.
Anything that could be understood on a scale. Could be quantized, quantitated.
So through sonification today, we have those sounds. So they're integrated, not as much as they used to be. I mean, I used to, have pre-recordings and insert a comet or something like that. My partner, he does that quite a lot. Lemon does that.
I mean, a spoken word?
No. Oh, well, he does. He has some monk chants. That's a word, but not I speak. I use the spoken word as a way to get to xenolinguistics. So I don't want to leave out the voice.
Right.
I don't know if you do voice, but I've spent a long time slowly catching up to my voice as an instrument, and inside of me trying to get that sound that is the very sound that I think runs us. So could I actually vocalize that? And so that's a reason that new kinds of instruments have come to augment more what the sound of my voice is doing. So yeah, I think that's where the sonic being comes from. So all of a sudden I become the sonic being speaking. I'm going to be the electric voice box of the synthesizer, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And that's become a very innovative, exciting kind of new opportunity for me to actually realize that I'm an instrument and to myself. And it is. I mean, we have opera, we have beautiful voices around the world. But then when you relate it to the construction of sound in your body, well, that's a different kind of voice. So that's I would say that's the newest element in my sound constructions. Mm-hmm. So if I were to ask you, what do you think is the newest element in your sound constructions over the years? Where do you find yourself now in terms of how you would like to introduce a new something totally new that you have never done before? Is that something in your...
Well, the thing that I'm doing right now, and it's not, I've been doing it for a little bit and working with it in different ways, is using feedback.
Right.
And having no sound source, just feedback. And it plays. I like feedback. There's something I really love about the idea of the uncontrolled energy. The whole concept is about living on the edge of nothing and too much, and controlling that and kind of dancing with it, and finding the places that you can steer it here and there. And I find that very interesting. I find it very interesting from a lot of points of view. I find it interesting from a technological point of view because it takes almost no equipment to do it. I find it interesting from a compositional point of view because what you can make from it is incredibly wide-ranging. I also find it interesting from a compositional point of view because compositionally I really like contrast. And the contrast that I have been working with recently is the contrast between what I call my modular tonalism work, which is very faithfully based on rigid, or not rigid, but on complex and certain tonal relationships and pitch relationships and scales and so forth. Contrasting that with the exact opposite, because that's highly controlled and this is highly, potentially out of control. Mm-hmm. and one is usually can be easily very nice sounding and the other one is challenging. So these contrasts are a goal to me. Mm-hmm. As a composer. They're things that I seek out. Mm-hmm. And so I don't find it, I guess, too surprising that right now I'm working with extreme contrast because I've been working with contrast for a long time. And, it's only natural that, to go and express all of the, positioning of the concept,
Okay, right.
So that's a new thing with me, and another not new really, but of always prime interest to me is the compositional thing, and I've just been feeling, compositionally, I just feel like the world is just really active, and I'm able to live it, and I'm able to teach it, and so the love of form and structure and developmental issues and composition and everything, I just find more fascinating every day.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I think one of the other elements of my own sound is I just finished a paper on this Ineffable. Effing the ineffable.
So define it for somebody watching this.
The ineffable is a funny word because its definition is it's something that can't be touched, something that can't be known, something that can't be seen. It's ineffable. And this other kind of upwelling within the body for aspiring to something that's beyond yourself has been, really with the cathedrals in Europe, with the big organs and Chartres Cathedral being put together, in a geometric way that represents the way sounds are supposed to be heard. So there's this upwelling of sound, and I think in the religious areas, it's the most popular kind of have. You have so many words, resurrection, just enlightenment, transformation. All these words are going from one world into another world, and they're pretty much ironclad within the definition of our cultures. It would be pretty hard for a lot of people to go, so you can't go beyond God. I mean, that's a no-no. You can't go beyond. There's nothing beyond God. God is everything. Well, that's well and good. God, that's the definition, that God is everything. So that we have this ineffability, that we already know that there's something untouchable, unseeable, unknowable, the master mover of the all. That sort of limits the capabilities of we as human beings, because we've already got a template that gives us a limit as far as we can go. So I have decided that I would try to crack that barrier by introducing a language in word that I try to create in sound, is that you have to reach this point, this threshold. I mean, is there a sort of a threshold of sound? A threshold of sound that allows the psyche to, for a moment, to break through the template of the given limits and all of a sudden explore something else. And the synthesizer has been that kind of a tool all of a sudden. It's a tool that opens up different kinds of soundscapes. The developers are giving us the opportunity for different soundscapes, but there's no philosophical overview.
Right. But at the same time, of course, throughout history, music has been known to be one of the things that can put you into another state, another place, somewhere you're not, somewhere you don't know where you are necessarily, somewhere you haven't been, it's beyond where you are. And so music has had this ability as an inherent ability. But of course, what's different here and what we're speaking of now is that you are trying to intentionally develop this as a communication element, aspect.
It's not new.
Right.
You're right. And Angela Voss, I just come across Angela Voss's work, 13th century music, 14th century music, was music that enabled you to go into the other realms. And the Renaissance came and took that knowledge, getting knowledge from the ether, so to speak, and using it. And then another fellow in England, Sir Roger Scruton, just wrote The Sounds of Music, and he was the one that I found the paper Effing the Ineffable. I just couldn't believe it. So it seems like there's a trend to find with the way music is going, to find out meaning. Is there any meaning in music anymore? Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I thought of Ineffable before I found effing the Ineffable. So I was so delighted. I just couldn't believe that it was in print. So I knew that, the trend, we could talk about trends, but I knew that there was this trend to find an undercurrent, this piece, an undercurrent of a trend that, is starting to emerge. Like the paper I told you about, kids like noise. So a PhD thesis, just kids like noise. And what does that mean? Does that mean that anything goes? There's no more meaning to the sound? And so all of a sudden I've found, a home where there is a meaning. You can get a meaning out of it. So you might think it's a religious meaning, but for me it's an opportunity, as I said before. If we're going to survive as a species, I think we have to come up with some sort of thought form where you're contributing to the continuance of our nature, our innate human nature, whatever that is, and give it the opportunity to go forward. I mean, that's the ideal. That's the utopian aspect to it, I suppose.
And what a better mechanism than music, given the fact that it's pretty much recognized as a universal language that needs no interpretation until it gets really institutionalized. That music is of course a natural way to be beyond where you are. It just seems to be the natural way.
It's great talking to you, Doug. I mean, really, I don't think I've found too many people that fluently can bounce back and forth on issues of what sound is about, why you make it, what your intention is, all these things. I think it's important for the audience or whoever's listening to it to pick up on that a little bit, and what is the intention of the electronic music as a medium for expression. I feel strongly about it, and I think this conversation really brings it to the front. Yeah, no, it's amazing to have the opportunity, since we live in different parts of the world, and It's amazing because we've been friends for a while to just continually better understand each other, and kind of cool to allow people to see a bit of that process. And today is February 15th, 2020. We don't want to...
It is. Yes, it is.
It is. Yeah.
And unfortunately, you're going to be going back today, but you've been here for a couple of days. We've been having a lot of fun talking about music.
Been a wonderful host, and it's been a great... The last time was 3 years ago, and I think this is a great opportunity to express. Well, so cheers.
So to the Ineffable.
To the Ineffable. Thank you very much, and that's the end of our video.